In late 1942, the German Wehrmacht was the most experienced fighting force on the planet. Its veterans had marched through Poland, France, Greece, and the boundless steppes of Russia. They had seen everything. When they heard that the Americans were entering the war in the European theater, the reaction among the rank-and-file German soldier was not fear. It was curiosity mixed with contempt. German propaganda had painted a very specific picture of the American male. They were depicted as degenerate. A mix of gangsters and cowboys, obsessed with jazz music, Hollywood movies, and comfort. The German soldier, raised on the Spartan ideals of Prussian militarism, viewed the American GI as soft. "They are not soldiers," one German officer wrote in a letter home. "They are civilians in uniform." They believed that a society focused on capitalism and consumerism could not produce men willing to die for a cause. They acknowledged that the Americans had good equipment. They loved capturing American rations, with their chocolate, coffee, and cigarettes. But equipment does not make a soldier. The Germans believed that the American reliance on machinery was a crutch for a lack of courage. "They will bomb us, they will shell us," a veteran sergeant told his squad. "But they will not come into the hole to get us with a bayonet." This perception was reinforced by the British, who, at the time, also looked down on their new allies. The British joke was that the Americans were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. But the German assessment was darker. They saw the Americans as souvenir hunters. Early reports from North Africa described American soldiers who were more interested in looting German daggers and medals than in securing their perimeter. They lacked fieldcraft, the instinctive ability to use terrain for cover. They were noisy. They smoked at night. They bunched up in groups, making easy targets for machine guns. To the hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps, who had fought the stubborn British Eighth Army for 2 years, the Americans seemed like a joke. They were rich, spoiled children playing at war. This caricature was dangerous. It gave the Germans a sense of superiority. They believed that when the shooting started, the Yankees would break. They believed that one German grenadier was worth 5 American GIs. And in the dusty passes of Tunisia, they were eager to prove it. They didn't realize that this softness was not genetic, it was merely a lack of experience. And experience is the one thing that war provides in abundance. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 was the moment the German caricature seemed to come true. It was a catastrophe for the US Army. But the failure wasn't just about tanks and strategy, it was a failure of the individual soldier. When the veteran Panzer Grenadiers of the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions attacked, the American defense disintegrated. Observers witnessed shocking scenes. American soldiers, terrified by the sound of the German screaming Mimiers, Nebelwerfer rockets, abandoned their positions. They left their machine guns. They left their rifles. Officers, who should have been rallying their men, were sometimes the first to run. That fog of war caused total paralysis. American units fired on each other in the confusion. Troops huddled in the bottom of ravines, refusing to move, waiting to be captured. The Germans were stunned by how easy it was. They rounded up thousands of prisoners. These prisoners looked shell-shocked. They were not the defiant warriors the Germans had faced in Russia. They were terrified boys who just wanted the noise to stop. Rommel famously noted that the Americans showed ineptitude in tactical situations. He saw them digging shallow foxholes that offered no protection from artillery. He saw them positioning their anti-tank guns on the forward slopes of hills, where they were instantly spotted and destroyed, rather than on the reverse slopes. It was a textbook example of how not to fight. The German soldiers mocked their captives. "Go home, cowboy," they would jeer. For the survivors of Kasserine, the humiliation was absolute. They had been beaten, and they knew they had behaved poorly. But Kasserine was a crucible. It burned away the naive optimism of the American soldier. Before the battle, many GIs thought the war would be a grand adventure. They thought they would march into Berlin and be home by Christmas. Kasserine taught them that the Germans wanted to kill them. It taught them that war was not a movie. The panic of Kasserine was the rock bottom. But in the American military tradition, failure is acceptable as long as you learn from it. And the U.S. Army was about to undergo the most rapid, brutal learning curve in military history. But panic was about to be replaced by a cold, hard rage. After the disaster at Kasserine, the U.S. Army didn't just change its generals, it changed its soul. General Leslie McNair, the head of Army Ground Forces, realized that American training had been too polite. Training camps in the U.S. had focused on drill, marching, and target practice on static ranges. The soldiers had never heard the sound of a bullet snapping past their ears. They had never felt the concussion of a shell. McNair ordered a revolution, battle inoculation. The training became lethal. The most famous innovation was the infiltration course. Recruits were forced to crawl 100 yards through mud and barbed wire. But this wasn't just an obstacle course. Mounted in towers above them were M1919 machine guns. And they were firing live ammunition. Not blanks. Real, copper-jacketed .30 caliber bullets. The guns were fixed to fire 30 inches above the ground. If a soldier panicked and stood up, he died. If he crawled too high, he died. Instructors planted quarter-pound charges of TNT in the mud next to the crawling soldiers and detonated them remotely. The explosions rained dirt and rocks down on the recruits. It shattered their eardrums. It terrified them. But it taught them the most important lesson of modern warfare: keep your head down. The phrase "tug the earth" became a mantra. They learned that the ground was their friend. A depression of 2 inches could save your life. Training exercises stopped being 9 to 5 jobs. They began night problems. Soldiers were kept awake for 48 hours, marched 20 miles, and then forced to dig foxholes in the rain. They were pushed to the breaking point of physical and mental exhaustion. Why? Because Kasserine proved that tired men make mistakes. The army needed men who could think and fight when they were starving, freezing, and hallucinating from lack of sleep. They introduced live fire villages. Soldiers had to clear mock towns with live rounds, learning to trust their buddies not to shoot them in the back. The casualty rate in training went up. Men died in the camps. But McNair and the other generals argued that it was better to lose a dozen men in Louisiana to save 10,000 in France. The citizen soldier was being erased. In his place, a professional killer was being forged. The new reinforcements arriving in North Africa were different. They were jumpy, yes. but they knew what a machine gun sounded like. They didn't freeze when the TNT went off. They were ready to meet the Wehrmacht on its own terms. While McNair changed the training, General George Patton changed the mindset. When Patton took command of the II Corps after Kasserine, he found a broken unit. Morale was non-existent. Discipline was loose. Patton believed that sloppy soldiers make sloppy fighters. He instituted a regime of spit and polish in the middle of the desert. He ordered that every soldier, even in the front lines, must shave every day. He ordered that neckties must be worn in the rear areas. He ordered that leggings must be laced correctly. He fined officers hundreds of dollars for minor infractions. The soldiers hated him. They called him Old Blood and Guts, adding, "Our blood, his guts." But Patton knew what he was doing. He was forcing them to pay attention to detail. If a soldier is too lazy to button his shirt, he is too lazy to clean his rifle. If he is too lazy to clean his rifle will jam. If his rifle jams, he dies. Patton famously said, "A pint of sweat will save a gallon of blood." He made them run. He made them march at double time. He demanded aggression. He changed the tactical doctrine from defense to attack. After Kasserine, the Americans had been hesitant, waiting for the Germans to hit them. Patton told them, "We are going to attack. And when we run out of ammunition, we are going to use our bayonets. And when our bayonets break, we are going to use the stocks of our rifles. And when our rifles break, we are going to kick them in the balls." He instilled a sense of ferocious pride. He made them believe that they were the best soldiers in the world, even if they hadn't proved it yet. He replaced the incompetent commanders with younger, aggressive men. He promoted those who showed initiative and fired those who made excuses. The transformation was psychological. The troops stopped feeling like victims. They started feeling like a dangerous weapon. They started to look at the Germans not as supermen, but as targets. The German intelligence officers listening to American radio traffic noticed a change. The voices on the radio weren't panicked anymore. They were curt, professional, and angry. The cowboys were putting on their war paint. The Wehrmacht veterans, sitting in their defensive lines, were still confident. They remembered the panic of Kasserine. But they were about to face a very different II Corps. They were about to face men who had been humiliated, trained to the edge of death, and led by a general who demanded nothing less than total victory. The soft Americans were gone. The professionals had arrived. April 1943. Tunisia. The II Corps, now under Patton and later General Omar Bradley, faced its final test in North Africa. The Germans were dug in on a series of rugged, rocky hills protecting the path to Tunis. The key to the entire defensive line was Deadlier, known on American maps as Hill 609. It was a natural fortress, rising 2,000 feet above the surrounding plains. Its sheer cliffs commanded the entire area. Defending it were the hardened veterans of the Afrika Corps. They had ×42 machine guns sighted in on every approach. They had artillery hidden on the reverse slopes. A few months earlier, at Kasserine, an American attack against such a position would have been a disaster. They would have advanced in the open, gotten pinned down, panicked, and retreated. But this was a new army. General Bradley, applying the lessons learned under Patton, ordered a deliberate, methodical assault. For the first time, the Americans used massive, coordinated artillery support. Before a single infantryman stepped off, Hill 609 was subjected to a terrifying bombardment. Thousands of high-explosive shells rained down on the German positions. The German defenders, huddled in their bunkers, were shocked by the intensity of the fire. This wasn't the hesitant shelling they were used to. This was a storm. When the shelling lifted, the American infantry attacked. But they didn't charge in a human wave. They used the fieldcraft they had learned in the live-fire camps back home. They moved in small groups, darting from rock to rock. They used the terrain to mask their movement. When a German machine gun opened up, the Americans didn't freeze. They returned fire with their own M1919s to suppress it, while flanking squads maneuvered around to destroy it with grenades. It was a brutal, slow, uphill fight. The 34th Infantry Division, National Guardsmen from the Midwest who had performed poorly in earlier battles, fought with grim determination. They scaled the cliffs, sometimes using ropes. They engaged the Germans in savage close-quarters combat among the boulders. The German defenders were stunned by this tenacity. One captured German officer reportedly said, "These are not the same men we fought last month. They do not stop." The Americans took the hill, lost it to a counterattack, and then retook it again for good. Hill 609 was the turning point. It proved that the American infantryman, when properly led and supported, could defeat the best soldiers Germany could throw at him. The soft civilians had stormed a mountain fortress. The Kasserine hangover was finally cured. July 1943. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. The Germans expected the Americans to rely heavily on their vehicles. The motorized society stereotype was still strong in the Wehrmacht high command. But Sicily was mountainous, the roads were narrow, and the Germans blew up every bridge as they retreated. Trucks were useless. General Patton ordered his infantry to walk. The 7th Army became a marching machine. The conditions were brutal. The Sicilian summer sun pushed temperatures over 100 degrees. The dust on the unpaved roads was ankle-deep, choking the men as they marched. Yet, American infantry divisions were covering 20, 25, sometimes 30 miles a day, carrying full combat loads. This was a level of physical endurance that rivaled the legendary marches of the Roman legions. The German rear guards were constantly being overrun. They would set up a delay position, expecting to hold the Americans for 24 hours. But the GIs would flank them through the rugged hills in 6 hours, forcing the Germans to run for their lives to avoid encirclement. The German commanders were baffled. General Hube, commanding the German defense, reported that he could not break contact with the Americans because they moved too fast on foot. This speed was driven by intense rivalry. Patton was engaged in a personal race with the British General Montgomery to capture the port city of Messina. Patton pushed his men mercilessly. The GIs cursed Patton. Their feet bled. They suffered from heat stroke and malaria. But they kept walking. They developed a lean, hard look. The baby fat of the stateside training camps had burned off in the Tunisian and Sicilian sun. A German staff officer noted in a report, "The American infantryman is physically very tough. He seems tireless. He does not need a road. This was a significant shift in perception. The Germans still considered themselves tactically superior in small unit actions, but they could no longer deny the physical athleticism and aggression of the GI. The souvenir hunters were now hunting Germans, and they were running them down. By the time Patton's troops entered Messina, beating the British by hours, they had walked across an entire island in 38 days, fighting the whole way. They had proven that they didn't need trucks to win. September 1943. The invasion of mainland Italy at Salerno. If Hill 609 was a test of offense, and Sicily was a test of endurance, Salerno was the supreme test of defensive grit. The Allied landing was a gamble. They came ashore right in the backyard of several elite German Panzer divisions. The Germans counterattacked with ferocious violence. They wanted to throw the Allies back into the sea. For days, the beachhead hung by a thread. German tanks broke through the lines, threatening the landing beaches and command posts. The situation was so critical that the Allied commanders seriously considered evacuating the beachhead, a second Dunkirk. But the individual American soldier refused to break. At Kasserine, when faced with German tanks, the infantry had run. At Salerno, they dug in. Isolated platoons of American infantry, cut off from their companies, held their ground against German armor. They used bazookas at point-blank range. When the bazookas ran out, they used gasoline cocktails. Artillerymen lowered the barrels of their 105 mm howitzers and fired direct-fire canister rounds, giant shotgun shells, into oncoming masses of German infantry. The famous story of Sergeant Audie Murphy, the most decorated soldier of the war, began here in Italy. It was a testament to the live-fire training back home. These men knew that if they ran, they would be shot in the back. If they stayed in their holes, they had a chance. The German commanders were frustrated. They were hitting the Americans with everything they had, but the line, though bending, would not snap. Field Marshal Kasserine, commanding German forces in Italy, had promised Hitler he would destroy the invasion. But he had underestimated the stubbornness of the GI. He reported that the Americans fought with a surprising, almost fanatical defense. This was the final nail in the coffin of the cowardly American stereotype. The Germans realized that while the American might not be as tactically flashy as the German soldier, he possessed a bulldog-like tenacity. Once he took a piece of ground, you had to kill him to get him off it. The beachhead held. The Germans retreated. The American soldier had looked the blitzkrieg in the face and hadn't blinked. By late 1943, a new element was changing the character of the American infantryman, the influence of special forces. The U.S. Army Rangers, led by the charismatic Colonel William O. Darby, had made a name for themselves in North Africa and Sicily. They were modeled on the British commandos. They were volunteers, trained to a razor's edge in night fighting, hand-to-hand combat, and amphibious raids. The Germans feared them. They called them the Black Death because of their blackened faces during night raids. At Gela in Sicily, and later at Maiori near Salerno, the Rangers performed miracles, holding off vastly superior enemy forces through sheer aggression and skill. But their biggest impact wasn't just what they did, it was how they influenced the regular army. Ranger tactics began to bleed over into standard infantry divisions. Regular infantry officers saw how the Rangers operated. They saw how they moved silently at night. They saw their expertise with knives and grenades. They saw their supreme confidence. And they wanted that for their own units. Former Rangers who were transferred due to wounds often became NCOs in regular units, teaching their squads the aggressive Ranger way. The Army began to emphasize patrolling, sending small teams into no man's land at night to hunt Germans. Before, American units had hated night patrols. They were noisy and scared. Under Ranger influence, they became hunters. They learned to crawl right up to German listening posts and take them out with knives. They learned to lay ambushes behind German lines. This change terrified the average German soldier. The Wehrmacht was used to owning the night. In Russia, they had feared the Soviet night attacks. Now, on the Western Front, they couldn't sleep easily. A German sentry duty became a terrifying ordeal. You never knew when a squad of silent Americans, faces blackened with burnt cork, would loom out of the darkness. The Ranger ethos, lead the way, started to permeate the entire force. It popularized the idea that the individual soldier, armed only with a rifle and a knife, was the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield. By 1944, the line between elite and regular was beginning to blur. The average GI was becoming a commando in his own right. By 1944, the German army was suffering from a fatal flaw that was slowly destroying its combat effectiveness. It was running out of officers. The German military system was built around the Führerprinzip, the leadership principle. Officers were the gods of the battlefield. They were expected to lead from the front, to inspire, and to direct every action. When a German lieutenant died, the platoon often froze. The NCOs, non-commissioned officers, were trained to follow orders, not necessarily to improvise new tactical plans on the fly. The American army was different. It was built on the chaotic, messy, democratic culture of the United States. In civilian life, the American soldier had been a shop foreman, a construction crew lead, a quarterback, or a shift manager. He was used to solving problems without waiting for permission from a superior. This cultural trait birthed the NCO revolution. The backbone of the U.S. Army wasn't the general, it was the sergeant. In Normandy and beyond, the Germans began to notice a disturbing trend. They would snipe the American officers, the lieutenants and captains, expecting the American unit to disintegrate or retreat. Instead, the unit would pause, and then a sergeant, or sometimes even a corporal, would simply take over. All right, the LT is dead. Smith, take the bar and flank left. Jones, suppress that bunker. Let's go. The command structure didn't break, it just shifted down a gear. This resilience baffled the Germans. A German intelligence report from 1944 noted with frustration, "The Americans have no respect for rank or order, but they function with a bewildering efficiency when their leadership is removed." The American NCO was a master of improvisation. He didn't care about the book solution. He cared about what worked. If a frontal assault was suicide, as the manual might suggest, the American sergeant would call up a tank dozer, bury the bunker alive, or use a bazooka to blow a hole in a wall and attack from the side. This initiative made the American infantry unit incredibly flexible. It meant that every squad was an independent thinking organism. The Germans were fighting a hydra. You could cut off the head, but the body kept fighting. This was the ultimate vindication of the citizen soldier. The Germans believed that only a warrior caste could lead. The Americans proved that a car mechanic from Detroit could lead a platoon just as well as a West Point graduate if he had to. By late 1944, the American sergeant was the most professional soldier on the field. He carried a Thompson submachine gun or an M1 carbine. He chewed tobacco. He looked scruffy. But he knew how to read a map, call for artillery, and keep his men alive. He was the glue that held the army together, and he was the reason the American advance never stopped, even when the officers were falling by the thousands. June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach. This was the final exam. Everything the U.S. Army had learned since Kasserine Pass was put to the ultimate test on a strip of French sand. The plan fell apart instantly. The aerial bombardment missed the German bunkers. The naval bombardment was too short. The amphibious tanks sank in the rough seas. The first wave of American infantry was slaughtered. Companies A, G, and F of the 116th Infantry were effectively wiped out in minutes. Officers were killed the moment the ramps dropped. Radios were destroyed. The men who survived were huddled behind the shingle, a small seawall, pinned down by murderous machine gun fire from the veteran German 352nd Infantry Division. In 1942, at Kasserine, this situation had caused a rout. Men had thrown away their rifles and surrendered. But these were not the men of 1942. On Omaha Beach, amidst the screams of the dying and the roar of explosions, something remarkable happened. The training took over. The battle inoculation kicked in. Leaderless groups of men, terrified but determined, looked at each other and realized, if we stay here, we die. There were no generals to give orders. There were no brilliant maneuvers. There were just sergeants and privates who decided to fight. General Norman Cotter walked up and down the beach under fire, famously saying, "Gentlemen, we are being killed on the beaches. Let us go inland and be killed." But it was the small groups of men who did the work. They used Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps in the wire. They crawled through minefields. They assaulted concrete bunkers armed only with rifles and grenades. Heinrich Severloh, a German machine gunner known as the Beast of Omaha, fired thousands of rounds that day. He watched in disbelief. He expected the Americans to retreat. He expected them to break. But they kept coming. They moved like a rising tide. One man would run, fire, and drop. Then another. They infiltrated the German trench lines. By noon, the soft Americans had breached the Atlantic Wall, the most heavily fortified defensive line in history. They did it through sheer, brute courage and small unit initiative. Omaha Beach proved that the American soldier had surpassed his German counterpart in the most important metric of all, willpower. The Germans had the better position. They had the better machine guns, the milligram 42. They had the surprise. But the Americans had the grit. They refused to lose. When the sun set on June 6, the beach was red with blood, but the American flag was flying on the bluffs. The ghosts of Kasserine had been exorcised. The panic boys of the desert had become the conquerors of Europe. If Omaha was a test of courage, the Hurtgen Forest was a test of sanity. In the autumn of 1944, the U.S. Army entered a dark, dense forest on the Belgian-German border. It was a place of nightmares. The trees were so thick they blocked out the sun. It was constantly raining or snowing. The ground was a slurry of freezing mud. The Germans had turned the forest into a death factory. They rigged the trees with explosives to create tree bursts, artillery shells that exploded in the canopy, raining shrapnel down into the foxholes. They sowed millions of mines, the bouncing Betty that jumped into the air before detonating at groin height. This was not a war of movement. It was a meat grinder. Casualties were horrific. Some rifle companies suffered 300% turnover. This was where the American GI became a survivalist. The naive optimism was long gone. It was replaced by a cynical, hard-bitten professionalism. The veterans, the ones who survived more than a week, changed. They developed the 1,000-yard stare. They stopped caring about uniforms or regulations. They wrapped themselves in blankets and ponchos. They stopped shaving. But they became incredibly efficient killers. They learned to listen for the click of a mine trigger. They learned to distinguish the sound of a German 88 from an American 105. They learned to spot a German sniper tied into a tree. They became experts at preventative maintenance, keeping their M1 Garand clean in the mud, keeping their socks dry to prevent trench foot. The Germans defending the forest were often confused by the Americans. They expected the Americans to stop attacking after taking such heavy losses. In the German army, a unit that took 50% casualties was pulled off the line. But the Americans kept coming. They fed fresh troops into the grinder and the veterans taught the replacements how to survive. Don't bunch up. Don't smoke. Dig deep. The battle for the Hurtgen Forest was a strategic mistake by Allied command, but it was a tactical triumph for the individual soldier. It proved that the GI could endure conditions that would break a lesser man. He lived in a hole in the ground, freezing, covered in lice, watching his friends die every day. And yet, he didn't mutiny. He didn't surrender. He just loaded another clip into his Garand and moved to the next tree. The German soldiers, suffering just as badly, began to fear this relentless enemy. They realized that the Americans were not fighting for ideology or for a Führer. They were fighting for each other. And that bond was unbreakable. The Hurtgen Forest stripped away the last vestiges of civilization from the war. It left only the primal struggle. And in that struggle, the soft American proved to be made of iron. By 1945, the transformation was complete. As the US Army pushed into Germany, the roles had completely reversed. In 1942, the Germans were the grizzled veterans, and the Americans were the scared kids. Now, in 1945, the American GI was the veteran. He walked with a confident, dangerous swagger. He was heavily armed. He carried an M1 Garand, grenades hanging from his vest, a knife taped to his boot, and a pistol on his hip. He looked like a walking arsenal. Opposing him was the wreckage of the Wehrmacht. The German army was now filled with old men and young boys, the Volksstamm. German teenagers, 15 or 16 years old, clutching Panzerfausts, looked at the advancing Americans with terror. They didn't see the cowboys or gangsters their propaganda had warned them about. They saw a machine. They saw men who moved with silent coordination. Men who didn't panic under fire. men who used their radios to call down devastating artillery strikes on a single sniper. The American soldier had become the professional killer. He wasn't fighting with the fanatical hatred of the SS. He was fighting with the cold efficiency of a workman doing a job. His job was killing Germans, and he was very, very good at it. When German units surrendered, the contrast was striking. The Germans looked ragged, malnourished, and broken. The Americans looked fed, strong, and invincible. General Patton, looking at his troops crossing the Rhine, noted the change. "They are the best soldiers I have ever seen," he said. "They are killers." The journey from the panic of Kasserine Pass to the victory in Europe was paid for in blood. The U.S. Army had learned the hard way. They learned that technology helps, but it doesn't win battles. Men win battles. They learned that training must be brutal to be effective. And they learned that the democracy they came from was not a weakness. It was a strength. It produced men who could think for themselves. Men who didn't need a dictator to tell them to be brave. The German veterans who survived the war often wrote about this surprise in their memoirs. They admitted that they had underestimated the Yankees. They expected to fight a rich, soft, lazy enemy. Instead, they fought a relentless, adaptable, and lethal force that beat them at their own game. The survivors of Kasserine had returned. And they had brought the check for the humiliation of 1943. It was paid in full, in the ruins of Berlin.